My name is Erick Ewaskowitz, and I'm the Director of Coaching and Training for the Southern Michigan Conference. For this third and final module of our racial justice training, I will be addressing the question, what can I do? What can I do in my corner of the world to fight for racial justice? We long for the day when racism no longer exists, and God's vision that all people might be one is reality. While we recognize we won't accomplish this on our own, we can, however, leverage our knowledge, resources, and influence to fight racism in our own context. In his book, How to Fight Racism, author Jemar Tisby provides a helpful framework for interrupting racism that he calls the arc of racial reconciliation. The A in ARC stands for awareness, R for relationship, and C for commitment. Tisby also describes this framework with the language of head, heart, and hands, which is familiar language for us as Free Methodists. With that in mind, what could it look like for you to engage the head, heart, and hands to fight racism in your own community and church? Engaging the head will require developing greater awareness of race and racial injustice. We hope that these last several months of this course have led to a greater personal awareness of the impact of the ugly sin of racism. We hope that you've developed a greater awareness of biblical justice and its implications for the church. We hope that you have grown in your awareness and understanding of the history of systemic racism in our nation and how it continues to negatively impact our communities and churches and just about every aspect of our lives today. We hope that you've developed a greater awareness of the ongoing racial disparities today in almost every aspect of society, in housing, wealth, education, and healthcare. And we hope that you will continue to educate yourself. There are many great books, articles, documentaries, and podcasts out there today. And we are in a better position to educate ourselves on racial justice now than we ever have been. We have developed a list of resources to help you continue in your learning journey. You can access these resources at the link displayed on the screen. We must also engage the heart. We must seek to develop and cultivate friendships with people who are different than us. It is important, however, to note that too often in the church, we have reduced racial reconciliation to merely building relationships across racial lines, and assumed that these relationships will put an end to racial discrimination. Cross-cultural relationships alone will not solve issues such as wealth inequality, disparities in education and housing, or voter suppression. Racial justice will require far more than cross-cultural relationships, but it also won't happen without them. So who is in your circle? Most of us are part of relational networks that tend to be rather homogeneous. In what ways could you begin to develop or further develop relationships with people who are not like you? Join a pastors network that is comprised of majority non-white pastors. Start or participate in a Be the Bridge group that includes ethnically diverse people. Be intentional about joining a gym, a club, or a local group where not everyone looks like you. Another word of warning here. Building a relationship with someone from a race other than your own cannot and must not be about tokenism. It is not for the purpose of being able to say to others, I have a black friend. Nor can it be about someone adversely impacted by racism being burdened with the responsibility to teach you about race. It is your responsibility to do the work on your own. What is needed are true, genuine, loving friendships that are not transactional, but transformational. And lastly, we must engage our hands. We must commit to fighting for racial justice in real and tangible ways. Look around your church and community. Every church and community is unique, and therefore each will present unique opportunities to work towards racial justice. But here are just a few ideas to get you thinking. Partner with a local public school. The majority of students of color who are disproportionately undereducated attend public schools. Whether mentoring, tutoring, working to increase parent engagement, encouraging teachers and administrators, or all of the above, serving your local public school is a great action step for pursuing racial justice. With regards to adopting a public school, Jemar Tisby again writes, any church dedicated to racial justice must consider how they can support and invest in their local public schools. Another idea is to identify one local issue that perpetuates racial injustice. Where do you see racial inequality in local government, education, housing, healthcare, or even in your church? How can you use your gifts, resources, and influence to get involved in and address these inequities? Partner with local organizations that are already doing justice work. We don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to working towards racial justice in our communities. Frankly, it can be dishonoring to the groups who have been faithfully beating the drum for justice for a long time. Who is doing this work already, and how can you get involved? Identify and dismantle unjust systems and structures that might exist in your church. Are there systems in place that hold people of color at a disadvantage from serving on your boards, committees, or in leadership positions? What about your worship and preaching styles? Who are these geared towards? Do we have underrepresented people groups in mind when we're planning worship services? Does your church have a plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion? A great example of a commitment to fighting for racial justice in our Free Methodist story happened in St. Louis in 1859, 1 year before the official founding of the denomination. John Wesley Redfield, the well-known ministry partner of B.T. Roberts, was leading revival meetings at a Methodist Episcopal church in St. Louis. These meetings were met with opposition and led ultimately to the pastor and around 90 of the church's members leaving the church. Left with around 150 people in need of a shepherd, Redfield asked B.T. Roberts to come from Western New York to help organize this new congregation. A few days after his arrival, upon coming face to face with the realities of slavery in a way he never had before, Roberts wrote, "The blight of slavery extends to everything. We feel its crushing influence even in our little meetings. God help me to do all I can in behalf of poor, suffering humanity." Well, this led to Roberts organizing and forming a church in which slaveholding was strictly forbidden. Free Methodist historian Howard Snyder described the significance of this church in his book Populous Saints. Snyder writes, "In Western New York, when Free Methodist churches were later formed, the free meant free pews and freedom of the spirit. In St. Louis, free specifically meant freedom from slaveholding and, by implication, freedom for slaves and the end of slavery, as well as freedom from the spiritually numbing influence slavery had in the church. Thus, it is accurate historically to say that the free in Free Methodists signifies freedom from slavery, oppression, and racial discrimination, as well as free seats and freedom of the spirit." This account in St. Louis is a great example of a leader in the church engaging his hands in a commitment to fighting for justice. He recognized the racial disparities and injustices in a particular place, used his resources and influence to dismantle structures of injustice and oppression within the church, and worked to build and form a more just and equitable expression of the church in that community. As we consider what it is that we can do to interrupt the racism around us today, my hope and prayer is that we wouldn't just laud the stories of our forefathers and foremothers who championed justice in the past, but that stories such as these might inspire and prompt us, like Roberts, to pray and courageously consider today, God help me to do all I can in behalf of the cause of racial justice. And then let's go and do it. May the Holy Spirit guide and strengthen you as you develop a personal formation plan to engage your head, heart, and hands in the work of racial justice in your church and community.